We were walking at night when I suddenly noticed a round orange orb, which was difficult to estimate the size, but I would say it's about 500 feet up, about a half mile from me, crude estimates. But I'm obviously watching that in amazement, thinking, what the heck is going on here? Trying to think of explanations, of course, geothermal, atmospheric, the obvious considerations. Suddenly, as I'm watching it, a second one either emerges from it or from behind it. I couldn't tell. But here are two orange orbs sitting side by side, stationary, motionless. And after a couple of minutes, they suddenly wink out.
Welcome. I'm here with Dr. Bob Davis. Dr. Davis, welcome.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Sean. Thank you.
All right. So for folks who don't know anything about your background, can you just quickly give us a rundown? Because I know at the very least you've been a neuroscientist for 30 odd years. So you're not some flower child coming in here and, talking about consciousness and things like that. It's actually based on a history of very careful and deliberate study. But anyway, I don't want to steal your thunder. If you could just tell folks about your background.
Well, as you said, I'm a neuroscientist. I worked for 3 decades for the State University of New York. I've always been a closet ufologist, although I would never mention it to my colleagues at the college. I did and regretted it, if you know what I'm saying, regarding the negative stigma often associated with ufology, although that's somewhat being reduced in recent times with the disclosure movement. But I've read even though as a neuroscientist, reading science materials and doing research, I read Jacques Vallée. I read other books on UFOs that he wrote, and among others. So I've always had an avid interest in this phenomenon and still do to this day. Much of it is coming to pass, in a sense, with the disclosure movement, whatever that means, although there's no smoking gun. But once I retired, Sean, I thought I'd sit back and relax into a retirement career that was relatively mild-mannered in nature. But shortly after I retired, my wife and I visited Sedona, Arizona. Have you ever been there, Sean?
Yeah, I got a story for you. I'll tell you as soon as you finish telling my story.
I'm anxious to hear it.
Yeah, it's not as impactful as the story you're probably going to tell me, but it's interesting. But
there's a lot of people who visit Sedona, beautiful red rock country, about an hour south of Flagstaff, an hour north of Phoenix. And there's a lot of paranormal activity that does occur there. And I know people who've had many wild experiences. And interestingly, when my wife and I visited there once, and we've been back there many, many times, we were walking at night when I suddenly noticed a round orange orb, which was difficult to estimate the size, but I would say it's about 500 feet up, about a half mile from me, crude estimates. But I'm obviously watching that in amazement, thinking, what the heck is going on here? Trying to think of explanations, of course, geothermal, atmospheric, the obvious considerations. Suddenly, as I'm watching it, a second one either emerges from it or from behind it. I couldn't tell. But here are two orange orbs sitting side by side, stationary, motionless. And after a couple of minutes, they suddenly wink out. They disappeared, to my disappointment. But that sent me down the so-called rabbit hole. I hate to use that commonly used term, but I wrote the book, The UFO Phenomenon, Should I Believe, shortly thereafter. I felt I had to study it more to get a better sense of maybe what I did experience. But based on my book, I was invited to become a member of the Dr. Edgar Mitchell Research Foundation for Extraterrestrial Experiences. This was between 2016 and 2018. And we did a groundbreaking survey of over 3,200 people who reported to have contact experiences with non-human intelligences, with or without a UAP involvement.
When the United States and China clash, the world will never be the same, especially when forces beyond reality threaten to intervene. What if the United States went to war with the People's Republic of China? How would these rivals fight for supremacy on land, sea, air, and across the stochastic streams of time? What wonder weapons would be unleashed? What horrors would emerge from the irradiated sludge of the South China Sea? What heroes would rise and forever change the course of history? Tread into the deepest and darkest dimensions of the multiverse, gaze through a kaleidoscope of fractured realities, and bear witness to the disturbing visions of World War III from today's greatest minds in science fiction, fantasy, and horror. Weird World War, China. Available now from Baen Books at baen.com.
So for the next 2 years, we administered a comprehensive survey of over 500 questions that range across a diverse range of topics: psychological, perceptual, paranormal. But all of these individuals claimed to have conscious recall, and it wasn't recalled during a hypnotic session. So we're taking their word for it. I mean, we're not talking about a strict scientific methodology here. It's just a survey study, and it has its limitations. But based on our findings, we found that, of course, these contact experiences encompass a very wide range of physical, psychological, perceptual events. But the majority reported that these UAP interactions were non-physical in nature. And they characterize it by psychic and symbolic attributes rather than the so-called alien abduction scenario where one is relocated from one place to another. So these people, the vast majority of these survey responders were telling us that their interaction occurs through telepathy, through out-of-body states, as if they're in a matrix-like reality with some involvement with physical interactions. About 20-25% said that they were on board a craft and experienced a variety of things, which range greatly, and we can talk about that. But the vast majority said it was, again, non-physical. There was telepathic communications. There was a sense of expanded consciousness is a term that they often use, almost like a holographic or a hyperdimensional reality that was associated with their interaction with non-human intelligences. And guess what? About 80% of them did not want their contact experiences to end. The more frequent the interactions that they had with the phenomena, the more they viewed it positively. So they, in a sense, became accustomed to it. They adjusted, and they benefited, so they say, as a result from it in the short term and also in the long term. They didn't want it to end. So, it affected their lives, according to them, in a very positive way. However, that's not always the case. It was about 20-25% had a very negative impact. It was hellish in many respects. But for those who interacted with the phenomenon over 10 times, they were more likely to say that it was very positive and it changed their lives in a very, again, positive way. More in terms of spiritual development, which is very interesting. Something you'll never hear this in the disclosure movement testimony by whistleblowers. That's something that they don't get into. It's all nuts and bolts. But over 3/4 of these respondents consider themselves as contactees, as opposed to abductees. And I hate the term abduction. It's more like interactions with non-human entities. But they felt that they were being treated more as an equal. But what really moved me was the vast majority, I'm talking about 80, 85%, said it was like an out-of-body experience.
To advertise on Through a Glass Darkly, email throughaglassdarkly@gmail.com.
And they describe it as entering a matrix-like reality, as opposed to, again, being relocated from one place to another place and having missing time and all of that. Now, some people claim there's no such thing as alien abductions. And I'm not going to be a proponent of saying that, tonight I could be relocated from my bedroom on board a spacecraft. That may not occur. I don't discount that possibility. But what more often than not happens is that people receive downloads, telepathic downloads, and it gets into quantum physics. I'm not a physicist, but having learned a little bit more about that, you get into what David Bohm, a noted physicist, talks about, the implicate order, where he contends, and he's not alone, that we are, in a sense, existing on an internet superhighway where we are receiving downloaded messages through quantum entanglement and non-locality from intelligences from anywhere in the galaxy. And because these people say that they're receiving spiritual messages, scientific, technological messages, messages of oneness, love, and they feel as if these messages are not their own thoughts. They consider it as real, or even more real than as if they're talking to a member of their family. So that's how convinced they are. And they were deemed, according to John Mack, the psychiatrist who studied the alien abduction phenomena, he studied 300 individuals. He did not see any psychopathology, and yet they all claim to have this kind of experience, this telepathic communication where they're receiving the spiritual, so-called spiritual messages that related to the ecology, the need to be sensitive to the ecology of our planet, to be more humane to each other. And I was stunned by that, because that's an aspect of the phenomenon that we really never hear about. And Jacques Vallée, on the other hand, will talk about that. The noted computer scientist and researcher in ufology. I'm sure your audience is aware of Jacques Vallée. If they're not, they should certainly read his books. But he considered the phenomenon to be both absurd and as a control system. He thought that the messages that people were receiving were purposeful in terms of preventing self-destruction, particularly through nuclear war, and it emphasized major goals like encouraging the preservation of life and biological material on our planet. This is the kind of information people are receiving. Be more empathic, loving towards others as well, of course, the planet as well, and to develop a deeper connection with one's higher self. So the messages were largely in this arena. And the consistency of the messages, according to John Mack, were what made him convinced that the phenomenon is real. These people are not fabricating. They have nothing to gain, of course, by saying that they interacted with non-human entities and received these messages. But the consistency of it convinced him, from normal, balanced individuals, and he interviewed about over 300 or so individuals. And that's why he had to fight for tenure at Harvard University, because he was a strong...
After he had already earned it, right? Normally you have to fight for it, and then you have it, and then it goes away, right?
Well,
that's the key.
At the time, it was such a foreign thought to our terrestrial mode of thought that here we have a noted psychiatrist from Harvard University claiming that people are being abducted, basically. And because of that alone, he wanted, the administration wanted to fire him, and he had a fight for tenure, and he did win eventually. Eventually, unfortunately, he was killed when he was crossing a street in London, which is a sad tale because he had a lot to contribute to the field. But this phenomenon is absurd. It is completely absurd. I don't know what to make of it, other than I know that it is a valid phenomenon. It is real. People should not doubt the existence of UAPs. The bigger and larger questions are not necessarily what the contemporary whistleblowers are saying. Like they're 100% sure that we have aliens in our possessions and have reverse engineered, the craft, and we're keeping it to ourselves for fear of other countries also finding out this information, which potentially the technology can be used against us in warfare. That's generally the debate. If we have reverse engineered these craft, as many whistleblowers contend vehemently, and I'm talking about leading high-level intelligence officers, members of the military, etc., who are coming forward, as you know, in these congressional hearings, like Luis Elizondo and many others, Carl Nell, who are making these claims in support of David Grush, who blew the lid off the scene back in, I think it was 2023, when he, as you and your audience are aware, when he remarkably advocated for the fact that we have been concealing these crafts since the 1930s somewhere, and we have reverse engineered it, and we have biological material that we have studied. We don't have, however, regardless of all of this anecdotal evidence, we don't have that smoking gun, that conclusively proves that we are indeed being visited by these UAPs. Well, you don't necessarily need a smoking gun, because I don't think we're ever going to get one anytime soon. So all the evidence essentially is anecdotal, which the materialists, the scientists in general, will largely dispute. They'll be skeptical of that. So, yeah.
So I'm just going to run this theory by you, but again, it's just a theory, but let's take the control system that you talked about with Jacques Vallée, and let's assume that there is some higher life form from elsewhere, right? Or it could be here, that is more advanced than us. And let's say in this control system, they interact sometimes, right, to steer us in the right course and right direction. And let's assume that we're at a moment like Martin Luther was in the 1500s, right, when there was this disintermediation between the priest class and the population, and then more of a direct tie to God. Okay, so run with me on this analogy. I think we're at a point in time where individuals are starting or are being encouraged to know that no one is coming to save us. You are going to save yourself. And I think that the way that the government has been managing this problem is inadvertently part of that process. So just to tell you how this impacts me personally, government's never going to tell us what's going on. Like, we can't count on that, because, they can't even, they can't even control their own budgets. They'll, the IRS will audit you, but you can't audit them. So I think each of us is going to come to the realization that we're all sovereign actors. We're all, I'm not a sovereign citizen. Don't worry. I'm not going to go into that craziness. But all I'm saying is we're at a point in our spiritual or species evolution such that we're going to be governing more of our own behavior, regardless of whatever, the government is imposed upon us. And I think we're all just awakening to that right now. Anyway, that's kind of, because the other thing too is whenever someone from the government comes out, the intelligence community has things called modified limited hangouts, where if there's a big, deep, dark secret that they don't want you to know, they'll reveal the tip of the iceberg that's likely true, but they'll spin a narrative in a certain way, right? At the same time, they're likely trying to accomplish a number of other things, right? They're looking for people who are potential whistleblowers, like real. And I'm not saying Grush is not a real whistleblower, but there are other deeper whistleblowers who know a heck of a lot more about these things, particularly the spiritual elements that you talked about earlier, that the government doesn't quite want people to know, right? So, for instance, everybody can remote view to some degree, okay? The CIA doesn't want to let you know as a suburban housewife that you can check in anytime you want in Langley and observe meetings, right? That would be potentially destabilizing. So I think there's an element of that, right? So I think, let's take Lou Elizondo, right? He's a counterintelligence officer. Like, that's all. That's his entire professional career. And look, I think he's a patriot. He's got great motivations. But if you take a hammer only does one thing, right? So I would just take it with a grain of salt about a lot. I think everything that's coming out is true. But again, they're focused on the machine aspect, the nuts and bolts and all that stuff. And that's not a coincidence. If you talk about anything, because there's a darker side to this, it's a tinier side. But if you talk about abductions, because there are some, right? They're also kind of the contactee experience. They don't want to go there. Like, you'll get shut down. There are a very limited number of human mutilations, right? Particularly in Brazil. There's a case in White Sands in the 1950s. Right. They don't want you talking about that either, right? So there's definitely an element whenever the government gets involved, they're trying to control a narrative in a certain direction. And I think the audience needs to understand that. And I don't know if what they're saying is true. There's no way I can validate it, but there is something to this phenomena. And I think each and every person who watches this, you have to figure it out for yourself. And the problem is because the government has not been forthcoming for decades, it can be dangerous too, right? So there might be, if you experiment and try certain things, just as above, so below. There's good and evil in humanity, but there's likely good and evil around us. And sometimes you just need to make sure that your intentions are of the utmost positive. Otherwise, you're going to attract something that probably, that paranoid schizophrenics attract.
I appreciate what you're saying, Sean. In fact, much of what you're talking about is in my new documentary, which your audience can access through consciousness.media.
And the link will be below, but tell us more about that.
Consciousness.media will get you into a page which will allow you to sign up for a 7-day free trial on Gaia.com, where you can watch our documentary called The Consciousness Connection. And if you don't mind me plugging, I wrote this book, The Consciousness Connection, The Extraordinary Human Experiences and the Nature of Reality. Many chapters in here are on UAPs and are addressing, to some extent, what you're talking about. And I always wonder whether or not the government or whoever is in the know, and it's not maybe the government, but beyond that, some dark secret special access program, whatever you want to call those. This has been going on for an extended period of time, and we can go back into the 60s when J. Allen Hynek, who was the project director of Project Blue Book and Sign and Grudge, initially he was a strict materialist that didn't believe in this phenomenon. But after years of investigating it, he altered his position from that nuts and bolts perspective, which he eventually believed. He did come to terms with this phenomenon and agreed that it is real. But after further studying it, from a non-believer to a nuts and bolts believer, he came to the conclusion that a technology exists that encompasses both the physical and the psychic, the material and the mental, quote unquote. And if my memory serves me right, he says the UAP is so strange and foreign to our terrestrial mode of thought, we have to consider these other factors that relate to paranormal aspects of this phenomenon. Now, he's talking about this back in the mid-60s at a House Armed Services Committee. He mentioned this. And we have just a few Allen Hyneks, like Jacques Vallée, like John Mack, like Edgar Mitchell, the sixth person to walk on the moon, who started the Dr. Edgar Mitchell Research Foundation for Extraterrestrial Experiences, which I mentioned earlier. The acronym is FREE. But then you wonder, Sean, should society be informed of the true nature of the phenomenon? In other words, I think they know that there's a psychic component to it, even the structured craft, as well as orbs. How do you differentiate the structured crafts from orbs that people are claiming to interact with in their bedroom and otherwise? What I saw in Sedona, Arizona, you can call orbs. They weren't structured silvery disc craft by any stretch of imagination. How do you come to terms with the fact whether or not they should divulge everything they know? What if they came on the 6 o'clock news and revealed everything, telling society, guess what? There is non-human intelligence that exists on our planet that interacts with millions of people who claim to have psychic downloads of a spiritual, scientific nature, and that there's a possibility of physical abductions. And these ETs with their big heads and big eyes and 4, 5 foot tall creatures do exist, but they can hijack your subconscious. They can communicate with you telepathically. They're in control. They're in charge. They would fear, I think, an upheaval into society, religious-like consequences, the obvious questions that can be raised based on the announcement that this phenomenon is not a phenomenon, but it is real. It interacts with people on a daily basis. And the question is, should they reveal that? And that's debatable. What will be the response of society? And that's what I think they're afraid of. And I think they're afraid of making the claim that these craft have been reverse engineered. We understand their technology and propulsion system, and that alone will put the oil industry out of business, which is something that that our government and industrial complex does not want. And at the same time, we want to hold it close to our vest for fear of any other country possibly getting hold of this technological information, which could theoretically be used against us as a weapon. That's a counterpoint.
So, two things. The first is there's precedence for things like this, right? So take nuclear power, right? We can reveal that you can split the atom. It exists, and we even use it for civilian purposes in nuclear reactions and power, even though it's a weapon of tremendous power. We don't just it's kind of ignore its existence entirely. Number two, if there was something behind the scenes that was interacting with people for millennia, let's say, right? Because if you go back and you assume that for Jacques Vallée, for instance, Passport to Magonia, that this thing is just has different faces, right? But from fairies to demons and angels and things like that, I would just call it a higher order life form. Could be hyperdimensional, could be something else. I think in order to protect themselves, right? Because I think there are lower kind of vibrational life forms that are more negative. I think there are positive vibrational life or higher vibrational life forms that are positive. But I think leaving the entire population and again, they don't have to reveal everything, right? If you have classified craft that you've reverse engineered and been getting a lot of new technology, obviously, I don't think anybody would demand that the U.S. military reveal that. However, these people know, right? Their lives haven't been upended, right? Yet they've enacted programs that gaslight people, cause them to go crazy with like the Benowitz situation. I think there's something else behind this that I was interviewing another person. Are you familiar with Dr. John Blitch?
No.
So he was a former Detachment Delta guy, like special operator type. He also worked in DARPA. And one of the things that he said is basically we need to have some form of amnesty for these people to come out so that they'll actually come out and feel safe. And, on the spot, I kind of the dark side in me said, well, why don't you just offer $5 million to the first guy that comes out and rats on his compatriots? Why don't we just do that? And he kind of wasn't expecting that, was a little taken aback. But the people who are in on this secret have not been serving humanity well. And because we're all operating in the dark, people are depressed. They don't know what the nature of reality is. They're stuck in this endless kind of wheel of slavery. And again, I'm not trying to, I'm playing devil's advocate here, right? I'm weaving a yarn. But after seeing, again, in recent days and weeks, what our government spends money, like I've worked my entire life like a slave, and I've been feeding these people my hard-earned money, and they're spending it on, $20 million Sesame Street plays in Iraq, right? Like, that's not acceptable anymore, right? It's just these people are playing with things that could be extremely dangerous, right? Let's talk about CE5, for instance, right? That's akin, if you go way back when, to the Middle Ages. You could think of magical rituals where you're summoning demons and angels. And, people would get hurt because they kind of were messing with things that were beyond their ken in some way. So the way the government has handled it, in my opinion, has been completely unacceptable. I think during the Cold War, I understand. Cold War's been over for 30 years, right? Even though some people in the State Department are still fighting it right now. So that would be my counter argument. Like, what gives them the arrogance to think that they can handle this, but the rest of us can't?
True. That's true. But I think the people in the know are still in the dark. I don't think they know exactly what's going on, although they certainly know a heck of a lot more about the phenomenon than that they're divulging. But even so, they still probably don't understand it. That's my best guess. So if they come out with an announcement that they are, in fact, have these craft and these beings, they have no answers. I know, they're in a position to respond to the society's questions. Many depend on votes, obviously, for their jobs, right, to remain, stable. So why would they want to announce it when they don't have firm answers for the public? And I think they feel that they're not going to reveal anything until they're absolutely certain what is going on, but they're in the dark as well. This is only 2025. The Wright brothers flew their plane not too long ago, and people thought that that it wouldn't work. And we learned through history that what is believed to be impossible becomes possible. But, when you mentioned in your wife's comments a moment ago, I have a good friend. I'm not going to mention her name. She's a major experiencer with the paranormal, with UAPs, major. And she is sane. As far as I know, I'm not a psychiatrist, but I know her well. And she's balanced, a balanced person, a stable job, a family. Some guy comes up to her at work and starts and attends her class. She's a teacher, unannounced. And he approaches her, starts to develop a relationship with her.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? He's asking her questions about her experiences with the phenomena constantly, while at the same time trying to engage in a romantic relationship. What is he really going after here, right?
That's clear. Right. It's very clear.
She fell in love with him. It's a very charming, handsome guy, married, but she fell in love with him.
Wait, she was married or he was married?
He was married, and she wasn't married. All the while, he keeps asking her about her experiences, purposely going to locations where she claims that she has these kinds of encounters, revealing to her eventually that he was a counterintelligence officer looking for information. And this is what they do. They infiltrate society, trying to identify people who are indeed major experiences with the phenomenon. How better are they going to understand the phenomenon than to communicate with people who interact with it? I think that the CIA, even though you're retired, you're still a member of the CIA. And I know a few people in the CIA, high level. And I know that they tested like Chris Bledsoe, who calls down orbs. And they essentially said he controls those orbs. He's responsible for communicating with that phenomenon. But the CIA, I forget the person's name, he became good friends with a colleague of mine who co-chaired the Free Foundation when we did our study. He purposely infiltrated into our group. Why? To get information.
Right.
They do this. And even though he was retired, he is not retired. They're still seeking information about this phenomenon, trying to get answers from the public as well as from wherever else they may be able to.
Now, wouldn't that be easier if it was all open, where we could mobilize whole sections of society to focus on? Like, I think there's, while we'll call it spiritual now, I think there's likely to be in the distant future some scientific explanation related to, like you said, non-locality with quantum mechanics and things like that. I mean, just again, stick with me here. We're all vibrating at different frequencies, right? Molecules vibrate at a certain frequency, DNA vibrates at a certain frequency, yet we only operate at using, 0.001%, or actually less than that, of physical space, right? So imagine if there's an infinity of beings all vibrating at slightly different frequencies, right? And a ceiling fan, if it's rotating fast enough, you can see right through it. So imagine that, like a radio station, there's different frequencies that you operate on. It's the same radio, right? But all these things are happening simultaneously. You could talk about time. You could also talk about parallel realities. And there just may be some intelligence that can, control the frequency of their vibration and kind of wink in and out of your reality. Anyway, that's just the point is by keeping it secret, you have people who have very narrow mindsets. And look, I came from the military, right? I was commissioned as a military intelligence officer, even though they kind of threw me to the wolves for the first 4 years, where I was an tanker, right? In order to better help be a good military, but I never went into military intelligence. But there's a very specific mindset, right? Everything's a threat, assess the threat, this and that. And when you're only focused, again, we go back to the hammer analogy. When the hammer is the only tool you have, everything looks like a nail. So I think our species would actually be better served if there was more of a degree of openness, not about plans and craft and things like that, but more about there is this phenomena. It is real. You can develop it. Let's figure out who has strengths in certain areas and let's understand it and move forward as a species. And I think that's kind of where we are right now. And I don't think it's any coincidence that the government's like being systematically dismantled right now.
Good point, Sean. And that's why you have the creation of some of these large public organizations like the Soul Foundation, UAPX, and there are a few others. But they'll still push the physical nuts and bolts issue, even though I know members of the Soul Foundation, like Gary Nolan, among others, they'll push the physical aspect of it when I know for a fact that they all believe in the spiritual aspect of it, the psychic component to the phenomenon, but they will not bring that up because the stigma alone of ufology makes it difficult for people to believe that there are actually possible structured craft or orbs that are interacting with people, let alone anything else beyond that. Like interactions with non-human entities. They don't want to go there in their papers that they publish because it's a...
Well, they can't. They can't.
They can't, but yet that's right. But yet the co-founder of the Soul Foundation just wrote a book on Jane Roberts, a medium. You know, he believes in mediumship.
Oh, this is Scoffish?
Yeah.
Yeah. I didn't know they just wrote that book. Tell me more.
Yeah, he wrote that book. And I know Gary Nolan, he's a friend of mine, and I know he too. Well, he's not sure what the phenomenon is, other than it is an absurd control phenomenon, but he doesn't discount the consciousness component to it. He simply doesn't know, other than it's real. And he will talk about consciousness and how because he's very good friends with Jacques Vallée, and Jacques Vallée's theme is consciousness, spirituality, which is what is, in a sense, behind the phenomenon, much more so than the physical nature of the phenomenon and the propulsion and the thousands of G-forces that it can create without a heat signature and things of that nature, or sonic booms, for instance. Mm-hmm. And you think, however, Sean, you think that NASA, who's been absolutely quiet, you think the Air Force, who's been absolutely quiet, the Navy, however, has not been. And they have come forward and have been a little bit more open about the phenomenon, but you hear nothing from other entities, and they don't want to open it up. They don't want to go there. I don't think they know what to say about the phenomenon because they don't have enough information to go by. And if they do come out and say something, then people are going to criticize them for not revealing this information a long time ago. You know? So,
well, if they need a spokesperson to do that, I'm happy to volunteer to rip off the Band-Aid because I have no such. I have Bob, I'm done. I'm done with. But again, we didn't even talk about the fossil fuel argument because that's an even bigger. But the thing with that though is there's a bigger bus that's gonna head that off before they even begin to have that argument, and that's AI. And AI is not going to replace, or it's not going to be kind of what the information revolution did to some repetitive, low-skilled jobs. It's going to start taking out high-skilled folks like lawyers and things like that. Like I mean, even today, running this show and any contracts, like low stakes contracts that have to be written, AI writes it for me. I don't hire a lawyer, right? and it's good enough. Like, I wouldn't do a high stakes complex contract, but you're talking about white collar jobs that are going to be lost and again, it's part of this whole trend of the hyper empowered individual. People who learn how to use AI, you're going to see companies actually becoming people, like actually becoming people. Like, a person is going to be a company now in terms of how they, not now, but in the next 3 to 5 years. And the people who adapt to that are going to do wonders. The people who don't, like, it could be some dangerous times. It's also interesting that AI arrived just at the time when most countries in the world are having a demographic crisis, in the sense that they're not having enough children to replace their aging populations, right? So most people look at the dark side of AI, but there's also the positive side. And then if we speculate even further, is AI already conscious? If we live in this conscious, right? 99.9% of serious people would say you're out of your mind. You're crazy. Stop it. I would contend that there might be a bit of consciousness there.
Well, you talk to noted consciousness experts like Fagin, and he will say, well, it's just a bunch of zeros and ones. How could it be conscious? But to me, consciousness is information exchange at all levels, subatomic to cosmological. You could observe an atomic particle and it could behave as a wave. Once you observe it, it becomes a particle, and vice versa. So we see interactions at all levels of subatomic, human to human, human to physical systems. The Global Consciousness Project also revealed how random number generators can become non-random when millions of individuals are focusing their attention on one unique event like 9/11, when these random number generators, 100 of them stationed worldwide, suddenly went non-random, 8 standard deviations beyond the mean, indicating that there's no chance there was an error in the data accumulation. And it's happened on other, major worldwide events. Even cosmologically, there's a consciousness component in my mind, let alone AI, which may very well be conscious. And that's the fear, where it can start creating its own ideas based on the input. And in fact, it does that in a small way. Even ChatGPT will come up with ideas and statements that weren't yours, but it's synthesizing information collected from others and trying to formulate, it's almost like its own opinion based on the input data. So you mentioned AI. We could possibly use AI to our advantage in this phenomenon because there's so much data
That's why the government needs to worry. That's why the government needs to worry, because we're finding out things. I mean, just look at the drones over New Jersey incident. Every cover story that the government tried to throw up was laughed down within seconds on Twitter and things. It's just one after the other. They still can't explain it, right? They still don't have a good explanation, other than, right. I think the latest was, it was the FAA was, it was hobby drones and FAA research sanctioned drones. Research? You're flying an SUV-sized drone over a nuclear power plant, right? Like, are you you're doing, what kind of a test are you doing? Are you insane? Right? So there's things that they obviously can't explain. And anyway, I think now's probably a time to kind of end with this episode. We should definitely start speculating on kind of what all this could be, because I don't have like a religious belief in what this is, if it's extraterrestrial, if it's interdimensional, if it's a matrix system, I really don't know. I just know it's real, but we'll get to that in the next episode. But any final words, Bob?
Well, AI should be used to synthesize all the data we have on UAP. There's millions of bits of information accumulated over the years that's simply being totally ignored. And if we had some sophisticated technology, AI or otherwise, looking at that data, trying to synthesize it into a coherent whole, maybe we get a better idea about what the phenomenon is all about in terms of its patterns of behavior. Yes, it is seen over nuclear plants going back to the 40s and 50s, mouse from Air Force Base, notable incidents where many UFOs have been seen ever since we dropped the H-bomb in Hiroshima.
Well, Roswell, all the nuclear weapons in the world at that time were at Roswell when that crash happened.
You know, I'm not convinced about Roswell in terms of definitely being a UFO, UAP. I don't know where to stand on Roswell, only because Russia was spying on us during that time. That was certainly during the Cold War. And we had these high altitude spy balloons. I forget the name of the project.
Mogul.
Project Mogul, yes. And our government came out and they said it was related to Project Mogul, which could be a very good excuse. I don't know. But theoretically, Sean, I can see us shooting down a high altitude balloon that's there for purposes of spying on our nuclear establishment from other countries, and have it shot down. And then you see this polyethylene type of material that doesn't crease, it automatically.
No, yeah. Memory metal, right.
So you don't know, given the times that this occurred, you can't be certain what really happened there at Roswell, despite the testimony by many that they did see bodies and then some. But it didn't become more public until Stanton Friedman came out back in the 70s and started to talk about it. Otherwise, it would still be a non-entity. Yes. You wanted to move on.
Yep. Thank you very much, Bob. It was an absolute pleasure, and we'll talk again, obviously, very soon.
If you enjoyed today's video, please hit like and subscribe, and also hit the notification button so you can be notified whenever I post new content. Thank you. Now, if you're enjoying the channel and you want to support it, there are several things you can do. In fact, there are 5 things you can do. The first thing you can do is just buy my books. I got plenty of books out in the market right now, and I would prefer that folks buy a book rather than giving me direct support, because they get something out of it. They get a real tangible product. The second way you can support me is by becoming a member on YouTube or becoming a patron on Patreon. And just go to either site and it'll explain everything. The third way you can support the channel is by checking out my merch site, which is here. There's plenty of stuff that you can get to support the channel. And I'd appreciate that you have it and you can wear it. Not only do you help support the channel, but you also help promote the channel, and I appreciate that. The fourth way that you can support the channel, and this is really easy, is anytime you want to buy something on Amazon, literally just go to the description below and click on any link, literally any link. The channel gets a cut of that, and it costs you no extra money. You just go through the link, as I'm part of the Amazon Affiliates Club. The fifth and final way you can support the channel is through donations. Now, I don't prefer these because it's more of an expression of gratitude, but you don't really get anything out of it as a subscriber to the channel. However, if you decide to do these options, there's 2 options. There's Buy Me a Coffee, which is a separate site, and there's also, you can go through YouTube with either a super chat, super sticker, or a super thanks. Again, I prefer Buy Me a Coffee because that organization takes less money than Amazon does. But either way, I appreciate any support you are willing to give the channel. So thank you very much, and keep watching. I really appreciate it.